let's start talking about what Kantian retributivism looks like. And so I want to be clear, I'm going to talk about Kantian retributivism sometimes and sometimes just full on retributivism, because retributivism as a view that punishment is largely about retribution, or that has to be an important part of it, giving criminals what they deserve, is not completely tied to Kant. There are other forms of retributivism out there. There are philosophers who came up with retributivist theories before Kant and after Kant, but we're going to focus on Kant. And Kantian retributivism, I think it's fair to say, is the main or most important form of retributivism in modern philosophy. So, what is this going to look like? What would Kantian retributivism mean for our justice system? What would a justice system that followed Kantian retributivism or any form of retributivism look like? Well, and let's just not put too fine a point on it. If you wanted to give a quick one-sentence summary of retributivism, the old saw, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, is a pretty good summary of it. I stopped the recording for a second. I had to look this up. I know this is in the Bible. I had to look at the book. It's in Exodus. This actually comes first from the Code of Hammurabi, which predates Exodus. Probably, this was all in the Near East. Probably, some cross influence here. Anyway, a lot of people hate this as an idea of what justice is, right? A lot of people will say that this seems like a cruel and nasty approach. I'm not going to stop the lecture to fact check this, whatever. There's that old quote that supposedly comes from Gandhi. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I am generally suspicious when I see a quote that's supposed to come from Gandhi or Einstein. But, supposedly an eye for an eye and the whole world is blind, right? People will say, okay, retributivism, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that is a cruel, nasty, backwards, barbaric, whatever approach to justice. Utilitarians especially like to say things like this. Is it really, though? And so one thing I will say is retributivism generally puts very strict limits on punishment. All punishments must be proportional. What that means is that the harm done to the criminal must be roughly equivalent done to the harm done to the victims. It means absolutely, though, the harm done to the criminal should not exceed the harm done to the victims. Ideally, you want it to be about the same, but you definitely do not want it to exceed it. If it exceeds it, then you are in the realm of using the victim as a mere means for Kant. For retributivists who aren't Kantians, you're just being unfair. You're not treating people properly. And, people trot out this quote from Exodus and the Code of Hammurabi. Sometimes you'll hear it from people who just want to be cruel and nasty to criminals. Sometimes you'll hear it from people who think that they're enlightened and want to be much nicer. But I think you have to put it in context, right? You actually have to think about what this meant when people put it down. And what it meant was that if the criminal knocks out a tooth or puts out an eye, you can't do anything worse to them than that. And when you think about, in the ancient world, a lot of times the punishments for minor offenses were being killed, being hanged, or worse. People have thought up all kinds of ingenious ways to kill each other. When you think about the fact that punishments were often death, you realize that this was supposed to be a humane code. If someone assaults you, the state, the government cannot execute the person who assaulted another person. If someone steals someone's money, well, the government should not kill them for that, right? And a lot of governments throughout history, even like the British government at the turn, in the colonial era, they were hanging people for stealing candlesticks, right? That would not fit with the Code of Hammurabi, or that's that line that's also in Exodus. Murdering someone, killing someone for stealing a bit of property is not proportional. A life for a candlestick does not fit this dictum, right? My point here is, because of this proportionality, in context, the Code of Hammurabi was supposed to put limits on excessive punishments. And retributivism, applied consistently, will put very strict limits on punishment. In fact, I actually think a consistent retributivist will put stricter limits on punishment than a utilitarian will. A utilitarian will always be open to disproportionate, unfair punishments if it creates good consequences. A retributivist will say these cannot be justified no matter what. Now, look, I'm not going to get on my soapbox too much, but let's just think about a few punishments. If you assault somebody in the state of Virginia, which can be, punching someone in the face, but it could also be something as simple as like shoving someone up against a wall or pushing them and they fall over, or even, I think threatening to punch somebody in the face credibly will get you this, right? Assault in this state can be punished with up to 12 months in jail. I mean, look, we don't always hand out the strictest sentence, the highest sentence, but it can be, right? And I want you guys to think about this, right? If somebody else punched another person a few times, even in the face, gave them a black eye, a bloody lip, if it was bad enough that they have scars or they're maimed, that might be one thing. But just getting beat up a little bit, is the harm done to the victim really equivalent to 12 months? I mean, I probably shouldn't go into this. I'll just divulge a bit of my redneck past. I went to a very redneck high school. I got in a couple fistfights in high school. Didn't tend to win them. I have gotten beaten up. It hurts, right? If your eye, and it's not great if your eye swelled shut and you have to go around, well, how did your eye, what happened that your eye swelled shut, right? But even I've gotten beat up. I mean, not terribly, not going to the hospital beat up, but I've gotten beat up. And there's no way in the world that I would say the harm done to me was equal to 12 months in jail, right? I mean, I'll just confess, in a lot of these cases, well, at least one or two of them, I threw the first punch, and the kid was giving me a hard time, trying to bully me. I'm not going to go out and just beat up people. I'm not that great in a fighting, so I couldn't beat people up, right? But even if he had just gotten it in his head to beat me up for no good reason, I don't think the injury done to me would be worth 12 months in jail. That's just crazy, right? I mean, a week later, I'm fine. It's a little embarrassing to go around with a shiner. It hurts to get hit. Unless you're just like, really maimed, unless you're really just beaten to a pulp, you're gonna be fine in a few weeks, right? I definitely think people who assault people should go to jail. 12 months, though? I don't know how much time is appropriate, but for me, and I say this as a person who has been beaten up, it just does not seem like 12 months is in any way appropriate. And that's for getting beaten up, right? Getting shoved or slammed up against a wall? 12 months? No, that does not seem proportional. Two others, right? Robbery. I mean, thank God I've never been robbed, so I don't know, right? I am going to imagine that if someone pulls a gun on you and takes your wallet, it is pretty traumatic. I'm going to guess that that does some mental damage that it takes a while to recover from. The same with carjacking, right? But the penalty for robbery in the state of Virginia is up to 5 years. I mean, really? I am not for a second doubting that it is traumatic, that it is bad to be robbed. Not doubt that for a minute. Is the harm from being robbed, even if someone pulls a gun on you, which would be terrifying, is the harm done to someone who's robbed equivalent to 5 years of someone else's life? Again, not to minimize how traumatic it would be to be robbed by somebody, but I have a very hard time believing that that's equivalent. Carjacking, up to 15 years. Again, I have not ever been the victim of something like this, and it would be very bad. It would be traumatic, especially if your car was to be wrecked and you couldn't recover it or whatever. But 15 years, almost a fifth of someone else's life gone. Does carjacking do that kind of harm to the victim? I don't want to minimize the harm, but that seems disproportionate to me. And I think a retributivist would say, a Kantian retributivist would say, no, 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 no. You cannot justify that. And one thing, I'm not sure what a utilitarian would say, but at least in theory, a utilitarian could justify it, right? In fact, I think for a lot of these things, they would justify heavier punishments than a retributivist, because a utilitarian would say, well, how much is it worth to deter this? Not what does the criminal deserve, but what does it take to deter this to the optimal degree? I don't know. Maybe Kantianism's a little more harsh than utilitarianism. Maybe I'm not being fair to utilitarians or whatever. I don't know. My point just is retributivism, despite what you might think when you first hear it, is going to set strict limits on punishments, and a lot of our punishments in our system exceed it. Now, there are some punishments in our system that a retributivist would think are probably too light, right? I'll just go on a limb and say a lot of the punishments for white-collar crime should probably be a lot heavier if you're a good retributivist, because they do incredible damage to people's lives, right? If Bernie Madoff or whoever defrauds you of your entire retirement savings and you have to work well into your 70s because you can't afford to retire, well, that really might be equivalent to 15 or 20 years of somebody's life, because it's really messed up 15 or 20 years of your life, right? So a consistent retributivist, a lot of even the violent crimes that we punish incredibly harshly, they would say we are too harsh, they're disproportional. I think for some of our white-collar crime, they would say, no, no, no. Given the harm these guys do, it should be a lot heavier. I don't know. I'll talk a little bit more about the restrictions retributivism sets in the next lecture. Just wrap up retributivism generally.